I don't know a lot about microbeads themselves, other than they are small plastics, probably spheres that are used in products where they're looking for some sort of abrasive property. I know a lot more about sort of plastics in general in the ocean. I think the bigger issue of plastics in the ocean is an important one, but it's also one where there's a lot of misconceptions about it. So you often hear about this Pacific garbage patch, and many years ago someone attached to that name a picture of a guy in a canoe trying to paddle through this big thing of trash, and that was shot in a harbor in Asia, not in the middle of the Pacific. In the middle of the Pacific, there's nice blue water that has very small pieces of plastic mixed in that water. And if you want to sample it, you need to drag a net behind a boat for a very long period of time. You do get lots of plastics. There are other areas where large bits of plastic wash up on the beaches. The microbeads are going to act more like those small bits of plastic, which are a concern because organisms can eat them, and we see that happening with small fish and other invertebrates, and even moving their way up the food chain into things like birds. One of the other concerns with any small plastics is there's some indication that those plastics can actually uptake other chemicals, and so they can act like sponges for those chemicals, and then they're fed on by those other organisms, and those chemicals can then get magnified as they move up the food chain. So I think as college students or any sort of layperson member of the community, we just have to make smart choices. If it's something you're concerned about, look at the back of your products and look to see, do you see terms that would indicate that there's plastic in a product that shouldn't have plastic in it, or you wouldn't expect to have plastic in it. Or sometimes on the front they advertise that the abrasive, whatever it is from apricot seeds or something like that, and really paying attention to the products you use, and recognizing when plastics are potentially necessary in the products we buy and use, and when they may not be, because the microbeads are one thing. All plastics can become microplastics because they all break down across time. It's a hard problem because this stuff is happening out in the middle of the ocean, and most people will never see it, and so getting people to identify with it as a problem is a challenge, and even getting out to research it is a challenge. And there's, even coming from the scientific community or the pseudoscientific community, there's so much misinformation about where the threat lies. And often focusing on the worst case scenario, like albatross in the middle of the Pacific that indeed are eating plastics and then regurgitating it to their young, and their young are dying. That's a problem for albatross, and we focus on them a lot. But there's a lot of other species out there, and knowing how it's impacting them, I think, is really the challenge, because they're unseen, and they're unseen by both the scientific community as well as the general public. I think a lot of it is about education, and unfortunately education has to start with information, and it's not an area that's received a ton of research. It's not been a priority for marine research, and so I think starting there and funding that research to allow that to happen, and then to try and get people's misconceptions away from the Pacific garbage patch to the real issue, which are these small plastics, and an understanding of what products they're in, and that there are alternatives that are probably biodegradable, and in some cases actually better. So I would know my wife has some like facial scrubs, and I've been looking at the labels since you contacted me to try and figure out what's in them, and some indeed have things like ground up seed husks, but others indeed have plastics, and I think telling people what the problem is and trying to indicate that it's a problem that it's hard to know how big a problem it is, but there are simple solutions, and we don't need to be making the problem any worse. I mean, I think there's always uncertainty when there's a lack of knowledge. And so we know that in theory they can take up chemicals. We know that they're around. Even when I take plankton samples from my marine biology class here, which I take in Puget Sound, we get plastics in those samples as well. So we know there's a potential for the problem. We know plastic is in the environment. The problem is it's hard to separate the existence of that plastic and the potential role that it might play in delivering pollutants or other contaminants, and move that up the food chain to say, is that having an issue with local salmon populations or herring populations or bird populations? And that, where you try and scale the issue up from the small plastics to the bigger ecosystem areas, that's where our lack of knowledge really breaks down, and that's where the uncertainty exists. I've seen microplastics nearly every time we take plankton samples, which is we're towing nets through the water and we're filtering that water down fairly small. So somewhere between 300 microns and maybe 20 microns. So 300 microns is about, what's a third of a millimeter? So thick human hair to things that are small enough to catch almost bacteria. And when you take those samples, as you're going through them, you often see weird little colored flecks or fibers. And even if you look in Puget Sound, you don't see it from the surface, but it's there.